fact-finding mission, which took place in February of this year. So I want to say hello to everyone in the room, but we also have people joining us from around the globe on Zoom. I can't see the screen, so I'm hoping you're all there and that you can hear me clearly. I do feel very fortunate to have been part of this international delegation, working with colleagues from a range of different legal traditions and each bringing their own insight into the situation in Nepal, which was at once familiar in a global context, but also unique to Nepal, was not only interesting, but kept us on our mettle. 3 of our delegation are unfortunately unable to be present today. They are Maria del Rosario Arango Zambrano, a transitional justice expert based in Colombia, Bruno Menzan, a human rights expert from the Côte d'Ivoire, and Kishali Pinto Jayawardena, a constitutional lawyer from Sri Lanka. Distance and timings make it difficult for them to be here, but I'm really hoping that at least 2 of them are on Zoom and will be able to contribute perhaps through a chat. I don't know how good our tech is going to be today. We've already had a few problems, but I hope they will be able to do that. So why Nepal and why now? And Nepal is usually in the news for the loss of climbers on Everest, or the mess that climbers have left behind. Earlier this month, National Geographic found the remains of a climber who'd been lost 100 years ago, and that was big news, obviously. But Nepal also went through a less well-known era of civil war between 1996 and 2006 in a Maoist rebellion against the then monarchist government, styled a people's war. Tens of thousands of Nepalis suffered serious human rights violations, including unlawful killing, disappearances, torture, rape, and sexual violence, a familiar catalogue. The war ended with a comprehensive peace agreement in 2006. It promised transitional justice for victims of the war. There followed strenuous constitutional and legal reform. However, over the following years, implementation of key promises to war victims has been a big issue. It's been a problem. And it was only in August of this year, after decades of campaigning and legal wrangling and intransigence on the part of varying formations of the Nepali government, it's that a law has finally reached the statute book. This delegation met with a wide range of organizations and individuals, including from the Nepali government at all levels and lawyers and others working in the justice system. We traveled to affected regions such as Janakpur and Nepalgunj, seeking a broad range of views. One meeting stands out for me. It took place in a park in Bardia, designed as a memorial to victims, sitting in the park with colorful structures all around us in a circle, as if at a school show and tell. We listened to the harrowing stories of conflict victims and their families, patiently recounted. It was striking to hear how important a transitional justice and reparations process remains, even after nearly 20 years. It's tragic, but familiar to report that many of those most deeply affected are from historically marginalized groups: women, children, Dalit peoples, indigenous communities, LGBTI persons, persons with disabilities, and victims of conflict-related sexual violence. All affected groups that we met expressed a strong desire to see justice done, perpetrators brought to account, but key institutions to be safeguarded, for there to be independence of the judiciary, the courts and commissioners. Our report produces a fresh analysis of the Transitional Justice Bill and Now Act, and you will hear from the delegation 2 prominent Nepali human rights defenders, not only about the toll that a war with impunity takes on a nation, but also what must now happen, the work that remains to achieve meaningful and lawful reparation to the victims of war and their families hereafter. These changes now arrive after decades of tenacious and courageous campaigning by human rights defenders in Nepal, and myriad voices and reports calling for a process of transitional justice in line with Nepal's obligations under international law, its own constitution, and judgments of its Supreme Court. This report offers detailed consideration of whether the new law meets these standards. Inevitably, victims' trust in the system is fractured, and the imperative now is for the Nepali government to implement a transitional justice process that rebuilds confidence, combats impunity, strengthens the rule of law, and affords inclusive justice. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to hand you over to Ben Leather from Peace Brigades International UK. PBI has a team in Nepal and they helped us with the logistics of our trip, for which we are very grateful. So over to you, Ben. There you are. Do you want the green light?
Yeah.
Give you the green light.
Thank you. Thanks, Sweeney. Welcome, everybody. I'm Ben Leather, UK Director of Peace Brigades International, PBI. For those of you who don't know PBI, we're a charity that provides support and protection to human rights defenders around the world who are facing reprisals because of the work that they do, protecting their rights and the rights of their communities. In Nepal, PBI's focus is largely on facilitating peer-to-peer engagement so that there's a peer learning initiative that strengthens the capacities, the skills and the advocacy networks of women human rights defenders and human rights defenders from marginalised communities so that they can effectively stand up to gender-based violence, to other violence in their communities so that they can seek justice and reduce inequalities in Nepal. PBI also provides support to human rights defenders in a lot of other countries in Latin America and in Africa, as well as Asia. And so when human rights organizations in Nepal asked for a legal delegation, we helped, as Sweeney said, to facilitate that and to bring it together. That's one of the roles that PBI plays, is try and bridge international legal support with the needs of the defenders and the local communities that we support on the ground in countries like Nepal. So I'm really delighted to facilitate this panel discussion, and I'll start by welcoming our panelists. So Dr. Mandira Sharma is a prominent Nepalese lawyer and human rights defender. Mandira was one of the founders of Advocacy Forum, which is a trailblazing organization in Nepal, which has pioneered really transitional justice cases since the country's civil war. Due to Mandira's work fighting for justice, she has faced smear campaigns, death threats, and even attacks. Mandira is also currently the senior international legal advisor at the International Commission of Jurists. I'd like to also welcome Geeta Razaili. Sorry, I told you that I would do a terrible job of your surname. Geeta is a Dalit woman human rights defender. She's the vice chairperson of the Women Conflict Victims National Network, and she's been fighting for justice for victims of the conflict in Nepal for 20 years. Geeta's sister, Reena, was tortured and killed by the Nepali army during the armed conflict, and that's what inspired Geeta to become a human rights defender and join the struggle for justice. Camilla Zapata-Beso is a barrister here at Doughty Street Chambers. She practices international human rights law, and she was one of the delegates that travelled to Nepal. She was also the lead writer on the report that we're launching today, and we are extremely grateful for all of that hard work. Ide Dijkstal was also a member of the delegation and also worked hard on the report. Ide is a barrister at 33 Bedford Row. She's an executive member of the Bar Human Rights Committee for England and Wales. She practices international criminal law and international human rights law here in London, and is also a US attorney and non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. It's really great to have you all with us. I'd also like to welcome the 30 or so people that have joined online, particularly those who are joining late in the evening in Nepal. And so we're going to have a conversational style panel discussion. Then at the end of that, there'll be an opportunity for questions from you in the audience, both at here and online at home. If you'd like to raise any questions at home, you just need to pop them in the Q&A box. You can do that at any point during the event. After that, there'll be an opportunity for those of you here in person in London to join us for drinks and food, which will be served at about 6:15 UK time. 3 quick bits of housekeeping. Firstly, the event is being recorded and will be on YouTube afterwards. The audience will not be visible in that recording. Those of us on the panel will. If you ask a question, your voice will be on the recording that will be on YouTube, just so that you're aware. So if you don't want your voice to be on YouTube, ask somebody else to ask the question on your behalf, but faces won't be on the recording. Secondly, phones off or on silent, please. And thirdly, I've been told to tell you all that if there is a fire alarm, it's because there is a fire. There's not going to be a drill tonight. And so if that happens, there are fire exits there. I've always wanted to do that when when you go on a plane. So there you go. We're ready to kick off. I'll start by asking Camilla. So Camilla, civil society organizations in Nepal requested this international legal delegation to visit Nepal to look at the rule of law and access to justice in the country in general. I'd like you to please tell us what were the key findings of the delegation in these respects, and also why you chose to focus the report on the issue of transitional justice in particular.
Thanks, Ben. So as Aswini has touched on already, the peace agreement that ended the conflict 18 years ago promised that conflict-related violations would be investigated, that victims would be released, would obtain relief, that the whereabouts of the disappeared would be publicized, and that impunity would not be tolerated. Some 18 years later, victims are still waiting for the promises of the peace agreement to be fulfilled. Until now, transitional justice has been halted behind defective legislation. Victims are still seeking truth and accountability. The majority of the disappeared remain disappeared. They've not been located. Victims continue to live with the catastrophic ramifications of the abuses they suffered, including life-altering injuries and profound psychological trauma, without adequate redress. With this new legislation that was being debated at the time of our delegation in Nepal, and which has now been passed in the last few months, an effective transitional justice process is now concretely on the horizon. And that is in large part due to the tireless work of victims groups, such as that represented by Geeta, and by civil society actors, not least Advocacy Forum, headed by Mandira. They have been campaigning tirelessly for almost 2 decades for a transitional justice process to be formulated in line with international standards and with victims at its center. The reason why that has been such an uphill struggle in Nepal is not least because accountability, particularly for those in power, is a politically inconvenient issue. There's a huge amount to be commended in Nepal's achievement of lasting peace until now. However, that has been in large part due to both parties effectively being absorbed into the state apparatus. So on the one side, members of the army retained their positions, and on the other side, the CPN Maoists became a major political party. In other words, they have both maintained or been given positions of significant political power. And as all of us here well know, it is most difficult to hold those in power to account. That is a significant reason for the legislative obstacles and delays. But it has also led to other practical difficulties for transitional justice in Nepal, which will be ongoing. For example, members of the security forces continue to appear to have access to evidence, data, and archives relating to their own violations that they may have committed. That will continue to be a real issue for the achievement of transitional justice. Our findings on the new legislation itself, the terms of the new legislation, will be addressed in detail by IDEA, but it includes that they exclude certain categories of victims from transitional justice and permit for amnesties, which would prevent criminal accountability for gross violations of human rights, including those amounting to international crimes. Our recommendations address those problems in the hope that they will be progressively remedied. Of course, the legislation is not the end of the story. It will still need to be interpreted by the Nepali courts. It will still need to be implemented. There is space for progressive addressing of these underlying issues. We are not the only members of the international community to have raised these points. There have also been calls for the legislation to be changed from international organizations, such as Human Rights Watch. I'm very happy to see colleagues from such organizations in the audience today. But other than the concerns around the legislation, the terms of the legislation, we have wider concerns. It is of crucial importance that the process, whatever model it takes, has vulnerable victims, including women, former child soldiers, victims from historically marginalised groups at its centre, a solid framework and clear roadmap for transitional justice, a concrete action plan, and an understanding of where the funding is going to come from is all crucial to that. It will all require international support and technical expertise, but for that to be forthcoming from the international community, our view is that compliance with international standards must be the irreducible minimum from the outset. In terms of the significance to the rule of law in Nepal now, this does not just end with accountability for conflict era crimes. Justice for past human rights violations, of course, prevents recurrence, it secures dignity for victims, former abusers are made to answer for their crimes, it establishes a record of past events, it promotes national reconciliation, and it contributes to lasting peace. Addressing the root causes of a culture of impunity ensures that those responsible for abuses do not retain positions of power and authority unchecked. Nepal continues to suffer from many of the root causes to the conflict. That includes present-day human rights violations, including by its security forces, societal, gender, and caste discrimination. The ongoing culture of impunity for state abuses in Nepal fosters present-day rights violations. We've heard a hope from victims groups that we met with during our delegation that transitional justice will start to transform the rule of law in Nepal and enhance trust in state institutions, which is seriously lacking. There is also a hope that it will fulfill the unaddressed aspirations of Nepal's people's movements, which were behind the conflict. We were glad to hear from elected government representatives that their imperatives are similar. We were also glad to hear that there was a keen interest in taking inspiration and models from other transitional justice processes, such as the Colombian process. Our overall conclusion, however, is, as I've said, whatever the model, adherence to international law and international standards on transitional justice must be the minimum.
Thank you, Camilla. Now, Mandira, as I mentioned when I introduced you, you've been working on seeking justice for human rights violations in Nepal for decades. So what's your overarching assessment of the obstacles to justice in the country? What does this mean for Nepali society as a whole, and where does transitional justice fit into that?
Thank you, Ben. Very good to see you all. I started human rights work in 1992, to be honest, by joining a group of medical professionals that used to provide medical support for torture survivors. And many of them were the victims of torture during Panchayat regime. We had the democracy movement in 1990, and that led the release of many of those political detainees. But when they got released from prison, they were released as different persons. First time I saw how torture destroys the personality of the person. So since then, I have been documenting cases of human rights violations, and I continue to do so. So I was part of the debate at that time, we should be really holding those people who committed those torture, those other kinds of violations, although I was working only on torture at that time, to account when we established democracy in 1990. But there was a commission of inquiry to look into the cases of human rights violations that happened during the Panchayat, especially the later part of the movement. But unfortunately, the political parties, the government at that time decided not to act on the recommendations of that commission, with the fear that that might jeopardize newly established democracy. So that was the time, maybe, reflecting back, I would say we planted the seed of impunity in democracy in Nepal. After the political change, we were also doing human rights work. We continue to document cases of human rights violations. Torture continues to be the routine practice in Nepal even today. But unfortunately, we were not able to address any of the cases of human rights violations that happened after the 1990s political change. And that actually provided some sort of grounds for the Maoists to take up arms as well. And there were human rights violations, all kinds of human rights violations committed by all sides. And we have been documenting hundreds and in some cases, thousands of cases of human rights violations. But unfortunately, one thing that really bothers us every day, despite all the efforts that we have been making over the years, with all the good intentions of the international community, with all the support from international community, even then, we have not been able to bring any perpetrators to justice. And that bothers us a lot. I think that really tells the state of impunity in the country. And we continue to face human rights violations today, although many of us think to or tend to think that the human rights violations only the product of the conflict, which is not the case. It continues to happen even today. So as Camilla mentioned, I think the past impunity continue to provides grounds for human rights violations at present day as well. So in fact, the impunity that enjoys by the perpetrator allows perpetrator to control the machinery, control the state, control the institutions, and they prevent any efforts to have reforms in the system. So as a result, I have not really seen any police officers being able to investigate independently any allegations of human rights violations. I have worked several years in prisons. Nepal's prisons are full of people as well. It's not empty. Why our criminal justice system only targets to certain peoples? Why police is capable of doing murder committed by certain people, but not by others? So these kind of questions bother us a lot. And we have been having breathtaking kind of changes in the recent history in Nepal. We have introduced new electoral system. Inclusive democracy is the promise of all political parties. We have been able to demolish monarchical system that was there for centuries. But unfortunately, we have not been able to even have proper investigations in any of these thousands of, any of the cases that we have been experiencing. So this is where we see the role for transitional justice. Transitional justice, if done properly, could actually help us to understand what makes Nepali society tolerates this level of impunity, or what makes us or our system able to, go with this level of impunity. And we also would like to know not only what kind of violations took place, but also who was involved into this, what kind of factors enable state institutions to commit these sort of violations, because these are important questions that we would like to ask and know through the truth-seeking process that transitional justice offers. At the same time, when we were advocating for transitional justice, we were advocating for a comprehensive transitional justice process. It's not only because when we started to have some discussion on transitional justice, we were immediately told that, oh, it's like South African model, i.e. the amnesty for the alleged perpetrators, reconciliations in the society as, i.e. the mediation between victims and perpetrators. But what we were looking for is that we don't actually need any other system or process that reinforce the problems that we have. What we were looking for is to really have a system, the process that is inclusive, that is victim-centric, and actually help us to unpack the truth about what really happened, and also justice for victims of human rights violations, some accountability for the perpetrators of human rights violations, and a kind of reassurance, the kind of guarantee of non-repetitions of these sort of atrocities to be committed in future, and the reparation for victims. So I think because of the lack of accountability and impunity, it really affects rule of law as well, because court orders, we have a long history, because from the day we started the debate on transitional justice, or having some sort of a legal framework on transitional justice to this date, we have come a long way. We have, as Ben mentioned, we have faced a lot of challenges in this journey. We don't have a sort of time to really go into the detail of that, but we have come a long way. So we now have the legal framework, which is faulty, which we will discuss later on. But at the same time, it has to be made implementable as well. We have very good constitution, but that doesn't get implemented. We have very good laws that doesn't get implemented. So how we make this law work without undermining international law, our international obligations, our obligations to the people, and also not without reinforcing the existing problems, is something that we are looking from the transitional justice process, and this is what we are advocating for. And what I don't really understand sometimes some of the development, like development partners of Nepal that has been investing a lot in Nepal for the last several years and decades should also ask why their support has not really brought any results. Rule of law, transitional justice, impunities are not just the legal questions. It actually affects us in everyday life. So this is something that we really have to understand, and we really hope that if there is an investment in transitional justice process to do it well, and we will discuss if time permits how we can do it, I think we could actually address some of the deep-seated problems of rule of law, accountability, and impunity in the country.
Thank you, Mandira. Geeta, you were a child living in a remote village in Nepal when conflict broke out in 1996. Could you please share with us what the war has meant for you and your family, and what your experiences have been of seeking justice since the war ended in 2006?
प्रश्नको लागि धन्यवाद।
Thank you for the question.
म नेपालको काठमाडौँ सहरबाट अलि विकट क्षेत्र काभ्रेको एउटा दलित समुदायमा मेरो जन्म भयो।
I was born in Kabre, which is close to Kathmandu, but it's one of the remotest areas of Nepal.
जुन समुदायमा आफ्नो एउटा पुर्खौली पेसा जुन चाहिँ आफ्नो फलामको कामहरू गरेर जुत्ता सिलाउने कामहरू गर्ने, त्यसले चाहिँ आफ्नो दैनिकी धान्ने मेरो समुदायको चाहिँ एउटा मुख्य पेसा हो र हो।
I was born in a Dalit community for whom the livelihood depended on sewing clothes for others, mending others' shoes, or forging metal into utensils and weapons.
जुन समुदायले आज पनि नेपालमा पानी छोएको चल्दैन र आज पनि त्यो समुदाय वञ्चित छ समाजबाट।
Even today, my community is considered to be untouchable, and the water we touch is not touched by others.
र त्यो समुदायबाट म लामो न्यायको यात्राबाट यहाँ आएर लन्डन जस्तो ठाउँमा आएर बोल्नु, आफ्नो कुरा राख्नु, यो मेरो लागि आफैमा एउटा ठुलो कुरा हो।
It's a big thing for me that coming from that community and to be able to come here in London and speak in this platform, it's a really big thing for me.
र हामी मेरो परिवारमा 10 वर्षको द्वन्द्वबाट प्रत्यक्ष प्रभावित भयो र मेरो परिवार जुन चाहिँ एउटा परम्परागत पेसाले चाहिँ जीविकोपार्जन गर्थ्यो, त्यो द्वन्द्वको कारणले गर्दा सबै छेदविच्छेद भयो।
Because of the conflict, my family was deprived of the only source of livelihood that we had.
र आज मेरो कथा चाहिँ आजभन्दा 20 वर्ष अगाडिको कथा हो र म जति बेला 13 वर्षको थिएँ।
My story starts 20 years ago when I was just 13 years old.
जति बेला द्वन्द्व थियो त्यति बेला मेरो दिदी जो पढिरहनु भएको थियो र उसलाई तत्कालीन साई नेपाली सेनाबाट घरमै आएर नियन्त्रणमा गरेर सामूहिक बलात्कारपछि हत्या गरियो।
During the conflict, my sister, who I went to school with, was taken under control by the army, was gang raped and killed.
र त्यो मेरो दिदी मात्र हैन, त्यो दिन चाहिँ अर्को एकजना त्यही गाउँको अर्को एकजना सुभद्रा चौलागाई अर्को एकजना केटीको पनि त्यसरी नै हत्या गरिएको थियो।
The same night, not only my sister, but another girl, young girl from our village, her name was Subhadra Chaulagai, was also killed in a similar manner.
त्यसपछि त्यसको 5 दिन पछाडि फेरि मेरो दिदीको छोरीलाई आर्मीबाट चाहिँ नियन्त्रणमा लिएर गइयो र 1 वर्षसम्म बेपत्ता बनायो।
After 5 days of that incident, my cousin sister's daughter was also taken under control by the army and was subjected to enforced disappearance for a year.
र लामो चाहिँ अभियानपछि त्यसमा उहाँ बेपत्ता बनाइयो 1 वर्षसम्म र राष्ट्रिय अन्तर्राष्ट्रिय रूपमा एकदमै ठुलो दबावपछि 1 वर्षपछि मात्र आर्मीले मारेको कुरा स्वीकार गर्यो।
And after lots of national and international urges, pressure. It was only after a year that the army accepted that they had actually killed my cousin sister's daughter.
त्यसपछि मेरो परिवार 1 वर्ष 2 वर्ष 3 वर्ष होइन 20 वर्षसम्म यो न्यायको अभियानमा छ।
It has not been just 1 or 2 or 3 years that my family has been in this fight for justice. We have been going on for more than 20 years.
म त्यो कथा र त्यो न्यायको अभियान त्यो सबैलाई बोकेर यो यात्रामा छु र त्यो कुराहरू आज यहाँ बोलिरहँदाखेरि मलाई पक्कै पनि त्यो त्यति बेलाको दृश्य भावनात्मक कुराहरूले थोरै गाह्रो बनाइरहेको छ।
I have been in this journey for so long, and while I'm speaking in front of you, all those painful memories, images come in front of me and it's emotionally hard for me to speak.
म चाहिँ 20 वर्ष अगाडि जे कुरा बोलिरहेको थिएँ अहिले पनि त्यही कुरा उठाउँदैछु भनेर म पहिलो चरणमा चाहिँ भन्न चाहन्छु।
In this first round, I just want to say that my demands have been same. I have been demanding for the same thing for the past 20 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Geeta, and thanks so much for coming and for sharing your stories with us and for all of your brave work. Of course, as we've heard, since the delegation visited Nepal, there's been a change of government and a transitional law is passed. So Mandira, we'll come back to you to talk about that law and how optimistic it makes you or not. We'll hear about the potential for justice finally being done.
As I said earlier, we have actually come a long way. In 2007, in one fine morning, we heard a news that a commission, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established in Nepal. They had already named the commissioners. And the mandate of that commission was to really provide amnesty for those who were committing those crimes in achieving political objectives or, performing their official duties. So basically, a commission was, declared to be established to provide amnesty for all violations that were committed during the conflict. We fought back. The government was forced to retract their statement, their plan at that time. And there were several attempts in between to pass laws to provide a de facto blanket amnesty for everyone committing the violations in the pretext that if we look into the past, that would undermine the peace process, that would undermine the fragile democracy in Nepal, that would undermine the coalition that had to happen in the country to bring this stability. So we from that point to the point where we are now today, we have come a long way and we have gained some achievement as well. So the law that has been adopted today has certain positive provisions, which are the results of our hard work. We worked for 18, we fought for 18 years, and that fight was not that easy. So this law actually does provide does promise to look into all kinds of violations that happened during the conflict. It recognizes that amnesty is not permissible for serious human rights violations. It also recognizes reparation as victims' right. It also promises that all those crimes committed in the past, especially those serious human rights violations, will be investigated, and there will be a special court to look into these cases as well. So from that perspective, I think this law is a little bit progressive, and we own these positive changes in the law. But this law also contains a lot of problems. The way it has been designed really provides a kind of opportunity to provide de facto a kind of situations where perpetrators of the worst serious kind of violations, even if that person is convicted, not to be in prison more than a few months, for example. So it has been designed in such a way that it would not recognize all violations that victims face, for example. And I'm sure we will discuss the more problematic provisions in the bill, in the act later on as well. So in owing to this problem and the problem that I highlighted earlier on, that this process, this negotiation was actually done by those who have interest to avoid accountability. There was no victim on the table negotiating this act. There was no representative of civil society organizations negotiating this bill. We tried all our best from outside. We used all our channels, all kinds of means really provide our inputs. Our effort was there, but we were not recognized as stakeholders while finalizing this act. So it was basically enacted by those who have interest to avoid genuine accountability in the country and who have been benefiting from the state of impunity that exists in the country. So owing to these underlying problems in the context of Nepal, I think we have a role to play. International community in particular have role to play to really have a monitoring of the implementation of the act. The first and foremost is the independency of the commission itself, how the commissioners are appointed, who the commissioners are, how independent the commissioners are, because we lack professionalism and independence in all public institutions, and we don't want to be repeated in this commission as well. And there is these provisions of the funding for the transitional justice process. There is an expectation of the Nepalese government that there will be a support from international community, and some country has already pledged that support. So that support, that funding has to be transparent, and the spend of that funding should be actually done also in participations of victims and civil society organizations as well, and not only to really prioritize certain components over the other, because there has been attempt to push victims or force victims to accept compensations at the expense of justice, their demands for meaningful truth and reforms agenda as well. So we do not want that to happen. So it has to be equitably distributed, and there should be a transparent international monitoring mechanism, the process in making sure that these problems that exist in the law would actually not be not influence or undermine international law in its operation. So that's where the challenge lies, and that's where we see the role of international community as well.
Thanks, Vandira. Heide, I'd like to bring you in. As we heard, when you were out in Nepal earlier in the year, the bill that ultimately has led to this act was still under discussion, and much of the delegation's report has an in-depth analysis of that bill and how it measured up alongside international standards and the expectations of civil society and victims about seeking justice. So what is the delegation's assessment of the law that's passed?
Thank you, Ben. So indeed, the delegation, in addition to a number of other issues, did focus on trying to get to the bottom of understanding the framework of the bill and its ability on its text to provide meaningful mechanisms of justice for victims, and also the adherence to international standards as well. And to do this, we spoke to multiple stakeholders, including civil society and victims groups as well. And there were a number of issues that we identified as being concerning with the way that the bill was drafted, the text of the bill itself, and how it could practically provide meaningful justice. So I'll run through a number of them. I know we have limited time. I don't want to get into too much detail because it's explained fully in the report, and so please do take a look at that, but just to highlight some of them for you. The first one that we were made aware of, and as we analyzed the text, noticed as well, was that the way that the bill is set out conflates human rights violations and international crimes. So the language that provides for human rights violations, yet the human rights violations are described in a manner that's more akin to crimes. So with human rights law, the focus is on the victim and the harm that's happened, and the remedies that flow from that are based on that focus, and crimes are on the prohibited act that the perpetrator commits and then prosecuting that individual. And so by conflating the two and describing human rights violations a way that's more like a crime, it confuses what the remedy would actually be, and impacts the clarity that victims would have to have a transparent and predictable process. So that was one thing that we highlighted. We also highlighted that there was an incomplete list of human rights violations, and Mindira had mentioned this before. The bill lists both human rights violations and serious human rights violations, and I think the first thing that the delegation felt a bit uncomfortable with was the fact that human rights violations were listed in two categories, which seemed to be like a hierarchy of rights. But then from that, when looking at all those violations, we noticed that there were some that were left off. Nepal is a member of numerous human rights treaties that list their obligation to protect certain human rights, and Nepal has agreed to that, but some of them were left off. So it lends to the question of whether those victims who suffered rights that are not in the bill are left out of the process. Amnesties was the third thing that we noticed, and Camilla had raised that before, that the bill had allows for potential amnesties, but only for those serious human rights violations that are listed in the bill, which gave us a bit of clarity of why there seemed to be a two-tiered categorization of the human rights violations. But this brought concern because amnesties in general under international law are something that are approached with quite hesitantly and with concern, particularly because oftentimes amnesties will deny victims the right to an investigation, and flowing from that, the right to the truth as well. And then also it would deny victims the right to accountability or justice through accountability, the prosecution of those who are responsible for the crimes. Just to highlight two more, because I know my time is limited, is just the limitation on the types of victims. So the bill's language appears to limit the recourse to only certain victims. So victims who were essentially intentionally targeted and who were unarmed as well. But we know from speaking to victims, from reports from civil society, that many marginalized communities included individuals who were forced into conscription and forced to take up arms and then disappeared. So for the loved ones of those individuals, are they left outside the process? Will they not know the truth about what happened to their loved ones who were disappeared? And the last is clarity on sentencing. The bill really just doesn't speak to, it refers to prevailing laws, but in order again to provide that predictability and clarity for victims so that they can go through a process that they understand, there does need to be more clarity on that. And our report, of course, provides recommendations on how to address all these issues. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Aide. Geeta, I'm really keen to get your assessment on this and to hear from you, in your opinion, what's needed so that you and others in your movement can gain the truth, justice, and reparations that you've been seeking for so long already.
मैले समग्र पीडितहरूको मागलाई यहाँ राख्नु पर्दाखेरि मैले बोलेको कुरा पक्कै पनि मेरो मात्र होइन, सबै पीडितहरूको प्रतिनिधिमूलक रूपमा मैले बोल्ने छु यहाँ।
When I'm speaking, it's not only me who is speaking. I'm representing all the voices back home, all the voices of the victims.
हामीले कहिले पनि यो भनेको छैन कि हाम्रो न्याय माग्दाखेरि सत्य प्राप्त गर्दा परिपूरण नचाहिने, परिपूरण प्राप्त गर्दा सत्य नचाहिने वा चाहिँ न्याय नचाहिने भन्ने कहिले पनि छैन। हामीले यो सबै कुरा जोडेपछि मात्र न्याय हुन्छ भन्ने नै हाम्रो बुझाइ हो।
Not at any point we have ever said that we'll be okay with reparation without truth and justice, and we'll be okay with truth and justice without reparation.
र अभियसली नेपालमा यहाँ आइ पनि सक्यो होइन, पीडितहरू धेरै अब गरिब ठाउँको जनजाति दलित होइन भौगोलिक रूपमा पछाडि पारिएको ठाउँबाट बढी प्रभावित भएको पीडित परिवारहरू छौँ हामी होइन।
It has come in the discussion also that victims mostly were from the backward, marginalized, and people who belong to the lower level, lower economic level of the society.
यसको अर्थ यो होइन कि अब हामी गरिब छौँ त्यस कारणले गर्दा परिपूरण देऊ अनि बाँकी केही पनि अब न्याय चाहिँदैन वा सत्य के हो के भएको थियो थाहा पाउनु पर्दैन भनेर हामीले कहिले पनि भनेको छैनौँ। त्यस कारणले गर्दा यो एकअर्काको परिपूरक नै हो र हामीलाई सँगै नै यो चाहिँ प्राप्त गर्नुपर्छ भन्ने हाम्रो हिजोदेखिको नै माग हो।
So we have never said that just because we are poor or we belong to that society, reparation will be enough. Truth, justice, reparation are complementary to each other, and that's what we have been asking for till date.
त्यस कारणले गर्दा राज्य जहिले पनि पीडितहरूप्रति जवाफदेही हुनु पर्यो र द्वन्द्वहीनता अन्त्य गर्नको लागि राज्य जिम्मेवार भएर यो प्रक्रियालाई चाहिँ सम्बोधन गर्नु पर्यो भन्ने हाम्रो माग हो।
So we demand that the government be accountable to the victims and reveal the truth and be responsible to end an impunity.
त्यस कारणले गर्दा अबको यो अहिले मन्त्रा दिदीले भनेको धेरै कुराहरूमा कुरा आइसक्यो, म दोहोऱ्याउन चाहदिनँ। अबको यो टिजेको जुन सङ्क्रमणकालीन न्यायको प्रक्रिया जुन छ त्यसमा पीडितहरूको अर्थपूर्ण सहभागिता र प्रक्रियामा उनीहरूको कुरा सुन्ने कुरा नै महत्त्वपूर्ण हुन्छ।
And Mandra has explained a lot, so I will not repeat what she said, but what we have demanded so far is the meaningful participation of the victims, inclusivity of the victims in the process.
र हामीले अहिलेको यो प्रक्रियामा हाम्रो थुप्रै असहमतिहरू छन्, कुनै धेरै कुराहरूमा हाम्रो असहमति छ, यो प्रक्रियामा नै असहमति छ, ऐनको बुँदाहरूमा असहमति छ। तैपनि हामीले यो अहिलेको प्रक्रियालाई एउटा अवसरको रूपमा लिएर आलोचनात्मक समर्थन गरेर अगाडि बढ्ने भन्ने हाम्रो सबै साथीहरूको चाहिँ यो निर्णय पनि छ।
We have some reservations to the act in itself, to the provisions in the act, also to the procedures that the government took. But having said that, we as victims also would like to take this moment as an opportunity and have a critical engagement in this whole process.
यो किनभनेदेखि अहिलेको यो ऐनमा केही सुधारहरू पनि अब छ, यो सुधारहरू आउनुमा हाम्रो लामो चाहिँ हाम्रो मेहनत छ, लामो यात्रा छ, यो पनि त्यतिकै अहिलेको यो ऐन जुन छ यो नि त्यतिकै आएको होइन, यसमा हाम्रो लगानी छ। त्यस कारणले गर्दा नै हामीले
And it is because whatever the legal reforms that this act brought, it just didn't come just like that. It is the result of our hard work, our fight for justice.
त्यस कारणले गर्दा अब हामीले अबको प्रक्रियामा एउटा कुरा अब मेरो अन्तिम चाहिँ मेरो अन्तर्राष्ट्रिय समुदायलाई मेरो अनुरोध के हो भने अन्तर्राष्ट्रिय समुदायले पनि बुझ्न पर्ने कुरा अब काम गर्दाखेरि
And the last thing that I want to tell to the international community,
र राज्यले जहिले पनि नेपालको सन्दर्भमा राज्यले जहिले पनि पीडितलाई केन्द्रित गरेर कहिले पनि निर्णयहरू गरेन र योजनाहरू बनाएन, पीडकलाई नै केन्द्रमा राखेर प्लानहरू ल्यायो।
Our government has not really put victims in center and somehow always centered their plans and policies towards the perpetrators.
अनि नेपालको राजनीतिक दल अथवा राज्यलाई के थाहा छ भने कसरी चाहिँ पीडितहरूको बिचमा खेल्ने, कसरी अन्तर्राष्ट्रिय समुदायको बिचमा खेल्ने, यो सबै कुरा थाहा छ।
And the government somehow knows how to play with the victims, how to play with the international community.
त्यस कारणले गर्दा अन्तर्राष्ट्रिय समुदायले काम गर्दाखेरि यो कुरालाई ध्यानमा राखेर पीडितहरूमा नि कस्तो खालको चाहिँ सहभागिता छ, कस्तो कुराहरूलाई ध्यान दिएको छ, कसलाई अगाडि सारेको छ, कसलाई बोल्न लागिएको छ भन्ने कुरो ध्यानमा राखेर आफ्नो पोजिसनहरू ल्याउनुपर्छ।
So international community should be mindful as to what kind of victims are in front. Have their voices been heard? Yeah.
र अब यो अब सबै अन्य अब संस्थाहरू अन्तर्राष्ट्रिय समुदायले काम गर्दाखेरि यो कुरालाई ध्यानमा राखेर अलिकति युनिटी एकताबद्ध भएर चाहिँ काम गर्न जरुरी छ र आफ्नो क्षमता र चाहिँ आफ्नो स्रोतको आधारमा काम गर्यो भनेदेखि यो प्रोसेस अगाडि बढ्न सक्छ भन्ने मलाई विश्वास छ।
And I think at this point, international communities should come together and mobilize their resources and expertise and capacities and put the transitional justice forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Geeta. So I'm keen to get to audience questions soon, but just another couple of questions for the panel to bring the panel discussion to an end first. And so if you can be as brief as possible with the remaining responses. So it's clear from all of the interventions that this is obviously a pretty key opportunity, key moment, great step forward, but that there are a lot of flaws in the law, probably not surprising given the vested interests at stake and the fact that civil society hasn't been consulted in the way that we would have hoped. The report's pretty clear on that as well and makes a broad series of recommendations. So Ide, from your perspective, what else is needed to respond to the shortcomings in the law and to ensure that transitional justice is moved forward in Nepal?
Well, thanks. I think what I covered before is really those technical issues about the text of the bill, but there's so much more that goes into it. And I should say, as far as those technical issues, the report doesn't only look to criticize, but really does encourage that there are practical solutions, and the recommendations really speak to that. And as Camilla had said before, there really is that space as well in order that is available to make those changes so that all victims, there is really a meaningful process. But a few other the recommendations that are included in the report and go towards a fully inclusive process include recommendations to the government to pay particular attention to access to justice and access to justice for all victims. And one of the things that we highlighted in the report was ensuring and facilitating access for historically marginalized communities. So women, former child soldiers, the Dalit people, indigenous communities, LGBTI persons, and those with disabilities as well. And to do this by certain solutions, the practical solutions like extending the time or the limitation period for submitting complaints and providing psychological support as well. Another recommendation speaks to the independence and impartiality of judges and the institutions that are at the heart of this process. I think that was mentioned before. And again, gives practical solutions as well about vigorously vetting judges and the commissioners for these institutions to make sure that they have that experience and expertise that goes towards peace building mechanisms, but also victim-centered justice. And victim-centered justice is not used just as a buzzword, but is actually realized in practice, which I think is something that you had mentioned as well. Lastly is to pay attention to and carefully document and preserve resources and data, essentially the evidence that's going to be needed to go through this process. It's now 20 years on, and we know that evidence starts to go missing or is misplaced, or memories fade even, just because of the time that passes. And so to take that intentional process to provide adequate resources for archives and databases, resources for investigations, and also to think carefully about where data, evidence, and those that information is stored so that it's safeguarded in an independent place. And sorry, the last thing I'll mention is that we also speak to civil society as well, because we were quite concerned to hear that there are some reports about a shrinking role of civil society due to legislative policies. And so there is a recommendation, especially since civil society is at the heart right now of providing that victim-centered justice and working with victims. So to make sure that civil society is given an active role and is really utilized and respected for all the good work that they're doing.
Thanks a lot, Ide. So we'll get to Q&A in just a sec, but perhaps to to kick that off and to transition into that, Camilla, obviously it's a comprehensive report of what's clearly a really critical juncture. And the challenge we have is to try and do justice to the report itself in a really short amount of time. But I wondered if there are any other key conclusions or recommendations that you'd like to highlight before we open to questions.
To go from where Ide left off, the role of civil society until now has been crucial. It really has stepped in where the state has failed. And we were concerned to find that the trend of legislation and policy as regards civil society, registration, obstacles to their functioning in Nepal was to restrict civic space. And so one of our recommendations is as regards that. It is our view that civil society will continue to play a crucial role, especially in representing victims' interests in the context of transitional justice. And secondly, as regards the role of the international community in all of this, there is an expectation, I've mentioned this before, in Nepal that the international community will step in to provide technical expertise, funding, donor support, etc., legal expertise. And that means that the international community holds a position of influence, and it is important that that influence is used in the right way, i.e. to encourage Nepal and support Nepal to do this in a way that is compliant with international standards. I keep saying that that should be the irreducible minimum, but it should be. It's the role of the international community to press on that. Until now, the UN has been unable to provide its support to the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and to the Commission on the Investigation of Enforced Disappearances, because its founding legislation is not compliant with international standards. So a lack of compliance with international law has until now led to material difficulties in the transitional justice process. We met with parliamentarians and the FCDO a couple of days ago, and one of the questions we were asked was, why Nepal and why now? And it is the question that Aswini asked herself when she opened this event. Why now? Nepal is at a crucial juncture, and this is a moment to be seized. The international community's voice as regards a transitional justice process that complies with international law will set the tone for something that has been long awaited by victims. So that is our final conclusion in the report.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Camilla. So let's open first a couple of questions in the room. We'll do a couple of questions in the room and some online, and then we'll see if we've got time for a second round of questions in the room. Hands up if you have a question, and we've got microphones that will come to you. You can see a clear one there. Anybody else? Okay, so we've got two together there. Let's do them. Thank you.
I'd like to know a bit more about what can be done, particularly on the part of the international community, to ensure that the specific demands of women victims and women survivors are addressed within the transitional justice process.
Thank you very much. Let's go straight. Let's get the two questions together, and then we can see who's best placed to respond to them. Please.
Good afternoon. I'm Bhagirath. I'm a former BBC Nepali journalist, now living in London. I've got a couple of questions, first to Camilla, and then I would like to go to Mandira. During your visit to Nepal, especially when you were visiting the family of the disappeared people, so it's been already nearly 2 decades. So how are they coping? And what would you ask the Nepal government and the parties in the conflict, how this particular problem of disappeared people could be addressed to? And to Mandira, you said that it's the amnesty is not something that we are looking forward to. So given the Nepalese political context, how optimistic you are that the commissioners to the new commission would be independent and capable people? Because most of the time the government seem to appoint their own party people. And what do you think the government should do to ensure that the victims get justice? Thank you.
Thanks both. So I think I'll invite Sweeney to come up and answer the first question, if you're happy to. Come on up. Come on up. Then everyone can see you. And then obviously it will be Camilla and Mandira who respond to the next.
Thank you. So I think you asked about the process of ensuring that women's rights are ensured and protected in this process. And I'm pretty sure you're asking that question because you know that women's rights have not been very well protected in Nepal. And that's in spite of what I mentioned earlier and what has been mentioned, that there's been a real process of legislative reform and intention in terms of structural legislation to do so. But over many decades now, very little has happened. Lots of reasons for that, which, you know, really would require a whole report of its own, frankly. But the key highlights, I suppose, might be, of course, as there was the intention to implement the National Action Plan, which came out of the UN Security Council's resolutions to do with sexual violence and violence against women, which are conflict related. Now that, you know, was started in 2010, 2011, and didn't really come to fruition. There's a second phase of it, which started last year, which is due to end next year, and very little has happened with that as well. And you're also going to be aware that there are entrenched cultural problems for women in Nepal. There's a really good evidence still of an enduring patriarchal culture, and that has to be fed into not simply a transitional justice process, but to justice processes generally. Now, there are a lot of people who are talking about it, and I think that the bill that and the act that we've been talking about does, you know, one of the things, I think two of the things that we say about it are look at limitation processes or periods that prevent women from coming forward, which is a culturally different issue as well. And there's a lot of debate around how many sexual violence cases post-war there are, and there's been the counting has been very poor on that. But these are structures within the Act that are intended to try and deal with that. They're still probably not good enough. And the other aspect of it, which we've covered in the report, is the need to support vulnerable victims like women in their giving of their stories and provide psychosocial support and that sort of thing, which doesn't seem to really have been there so far. So yes, it's a mixed message, really. There is a lot of stuff that's there, but as you know, not really been implemented. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Sweeney. Who would like to go first?
I think the next question was first addressed to me.
Yeah.
So as regards some of the priorities regarding victims of enforced disappearances, one of the things we had anxious concerns about was the destiny of archives compiled by local peace committees in the context of some initial reparations programs that were affected, which compiled some data as regards the identity of victims, but also just generally as regards the archives and evidence held by state institutions, not least the security forces. No one has had access, no independent investigative mechanism has had access to military barracks or military archives. And that is the first place you would think that an investigative mechanism would look for the location of the disappeared, and indeed remains. So there is a real worry as regards safeguarding archives in Nepal. The delay in delivering justice has meant a delay in safeguarding these archives. The bill deals to an extent with an obligation for state agencies to cooperate with investigative mechanisms, but it does not provide for independent safeguarding of conflict era evidence held by parties to the conflict. And that, in our view, is a real problem, because the accessibility of evidence, its security and safety will ensure the viability of investigations and prosecutions. Nor does the bill provide for the suspension from public office of public officials against whom a prosecution has been filed, nor does it include vetting as a form of punishment available to the special court. And we know that that is against international guidance, particularly from the UN Committee Against Torture, as regards the prohibition on state officials being allowed to continue in their positions during torture investigations, for example. A second issue is going to be technical expertise. We had a member of our delegation, Maria, is a Colombian expert, and the Colombian experience shows that locating the disappeared and excavating remains requires real technical expertise, and it's hoped by certainly by the state representatives we met that that will be met with international support and civil society support, which compounds, I think, our recommendations on the need to ensure that international support and civil society support is geared towards the right areas in Nepal, that civil society is supported and given proper space to function, because they will be crucial to the practical implementation of transitional justice, including the technical expertise it will rely on. Mandira?
There was this question how international community could support to bring the voices of women in front, or to address some of the violations that women face. I think one of the challenges that we have been facing is how we build the system, or how this transitional justice process ensures confidentiality of those, especially those survivors who suffer sexual and gender-based violence, for example. We have been experiencing persistent kind of discriminations, even in the distribution of interim relief program, because of the social stigma, because of so many other barriers, especially those victims of sexual violence are not able to report their violation that they suffer to any of these state mechanisms. We have, while cases were happening, we documented their stories. We were in touch with them. They needed medical support. They were in medical facilities, but they had to lie what happened to them. So even the medical report has been, in a way falsified from the very beginning. And what kind of evidences that we look into when we, investigate these crimes, and whether our investigators, meaning the Truth Commission now, because Truth Commission is the sole investigatory arm of prosecution for all kind of violations under this transitional justice process. So whether there are capacity, understanding of the investigators to understand this fact, and also interpret the rule of evidences in such a way that really provides remedies for the victims of sexual violence, is a big challenge. And this is what we really wanted to reflect or recognize in the bill as well. For example, now the Act provides a separate unit to document the stories of the survivors. But there is already a sort of plan or understanding in the state machinery that we will not have evidences on any of these cases. What we will do is to provide relief and reparations. There is this expectations that there won't be any cases for prosecution in the cases of sexual and gender-based violence. There is no effort how we overcome this, but the effort is, okay, we will be safe, right? So that mindset has to be changed. For that to happen, we need a big push from international community, big push from civil society organizations and the survivors institutions. There is a lot of pushback again from the state, because those who are demanding accountability, more robust kind of process, asking for clarity on which law that we are going to use, what should be the rules of evidences, are actually presented as or labeled as troublemaker, spoilers, agent of Western imperialist, dollar mongers, all kinds of label that have been put forward for those kind of victims groups and civil society organizations. But this is where international community should really come in. What are the procedures that were followed in other contexts? If there are things that can be learned from other contexts as well, how can we ensure confidentiality while doing investigations? What can be learned from other experiences? how rule of evidences, rule of procedures can be changed to make it more gender friendly, how our medical professionals could be trained, our investigators are trained, are something where we are looking for international support. When there is no investigation in the past, how can we believe that they will do proper investigation now? I mean, they have not done any investigations of this kind of violations in the past, and suddenly we have to believe that, you know, they will do. So it's not going to happen, you know, work that way. So the trained human resource is also very, very important. And where do we get it? How do we bring this is the area where we need to work in. The other issue is that this law at the face does prohibits amnesty for those involved in serious human rights violations. But how serious human rights violation is defined is problematic, as ID has already mentioned. But in other violations, it appears that it is conditional amnesty. It is not blanket amnesty. There will be investigation. There will be reparation. On the conditions of disclosure of truth, there will be amnesty. That's how the present law projects is provision. But as many other violations like crimes against humanity, war crimes are not really recognized as violations, for example. So de facto, those involved in crimes against humanity and war crimes will enjoy amnesty, de facto amnesty. So this is the problem in the law. So that's why while operationalizing this law, while implementing this law, it has to be interpreted. The commissioners should be capable enough to interpret that mandate, that it would not undermine, their work does not undermine international law, international standards. So how we ensure the independence of the commissioners is the million-dollar question, because all our institutions, inclusivity is something which is interpreted as if inclusion of all political party representatives, right? This is how it has been done, and none of the institutions actually function independently in Nepal. That is the reason why they are not able to deliver their mandates. This is the reason why our police could not really investigate these cases well. It is capable enough of doing murder committed by the Dalit, but not by the minister, for example. So how we ensure independence is the question, but there too, we could actually explore different possible ways. For example, having a sort of public vetting of the commissioners, making people ineligible to be commissioner if they have participated in human rights violations, or they have been a member of organized member of any political parties, for example, whether they have credential working in these areas or not, whether they have experiences working in these areas or not. There could be different tools and mechanisms that could be put into place, whether victims also have opportunities to vet the commissioners, for example, whether civil society organizations could also vet the commissioners. There could be different tools that we can introduce, and this could be done in practice as well. And this is where we need to push in the context where there is no interest to have independent commissioners commission in the country.
Ben, I'm going to add one more thing. I've been asked to by other delegates. In addition to independence, in addition to vetting, one of the recommendations we make is as regards the representativeness of commissioners and of judges. In addition to gender representation, ethnic and cultural representation. Victim-centered justice means not just justice that centers women, but also one that has in mind the fact that historically marginalized communities suffered particularly during the conflict. It is important that they are represented in decision-making, and that transitional justice responds to their particular issues.
Thanks, Camilla. We're almost out of time. I'd like to apologize for being on my phone. I'm not updating my Instagram. I'm liaising with colleagues about the questions that have come from the audience online. We've got tens of people tuning in, particularly from Nepal. A number of questions were raised earlier on about the flaws in the law, about issues of sexual and gender-based violence, and about how we can really end impunity and ensure accountability. I think a lot of that has been covered already in the responses. So I'm just going to raise a couple of questions that have come up online for Geeta and Mandira. I'll ask them both, and we've got about 10 minutes for you both to respond to them, if you can. They were raised anonymously. The first one is, what can be done to mobilize change and to take this from just another report to tangible change for victims, including those in the diaspora? That's the first question to both of you. And the second one to both of you as well is, as civil society, what are the priorities to move forward now with the transitional justice process? What next? Is it working on reform of the current law or working on reparation for victims? So what can be done to mobilize change, and what next? I think we can tie them together and hear from you both before we finish up.
धन्यवाद प्रश्नको लागि।
Thank you for the question.
यो खास अहिले पनि हामीले भनि नै सकेको विषय हो होइन। यो रिपारेसन र न्याय सत्य भन्ने कुरा यो छुट्याएर उठाउने विषय होइन, यो अहिले पनि मैले भने होइन।
I have told this earlier also that truth, justice, and reparation cannot be separated.
रिपारेसन भित्र थुप्रै कुराहरू पर्छन् होइन, त्यसलाई अब मैले यहाँ व्याख्या गरिरहनु पर्दैन।
I don't think I need to explain what a reparation constitutes. It can comprise of many things.
त्यस कारणले गर्दा यो अहिले मैले अहिले भनेको एउटा कुरा यहाँहरूले याद गर्नु भएको छ भने, कसरी चाहिँ त्यो को मान्छेलाई के भन्दाखेरि ठिक हुन्छ भनेर त्यो राज्यले खेल्छ भन्ने शब्द जुन बोलेको थिएँ नि, त्यो कुरा चाहिँ अहिले रिपारेसन र यो के जस्टिस न्यायलाई चाहिँ त्यसरी यो शब्दमा खेल्न खोजिरहेको छ खास भन्ने हो भने।
Like I said before, that the government knows what it should say to play with the victims, and the fact that now the government is talking about truth, justice, and reparation is nothing more than just a play of the words.
त्यस कारणले गर्दा अब हामीले जस्टिसको कुरा उठाउँदाखेरि रिपारेसन चाहिँदैन भन्यो भनेर चाहिँ त्यो प्रचार गरिदिने के, त्यसो हुँदा भिक्टिमहरूलाई चाहिँ जसलाई रिपारेसन एकदमै तत्कालै चाहिएको छ, जसको उपचार गर्नु परेको छ, जसलाई स्वास्थ्य उपचार, मानसिक उपचार थुप्रै कुराहरू चाहिएको छ, त्यो मान्छेलाई त फर्स्ट रिपारेसन भन्नु भयो नि त।
So when we advocate about truth, it is projected in such a way that we might not need reparation, and the victims who need an urgent medical care, for instance, might be thinking that we are just talking about talking about the truth.
त्यस कारणले गर्दा यो दुईटा कुरा सँगसँगै अगाडि बढ्नुपर्छ। रिपारेसन आवश्यकताको आधारमा र चाहिँ आवश्यकताको आधारमा यो खास पहिला नै दिन सक्छ, पहिला पनि दिनुपर्ने हो, अहिले कुरेरै बस्नु पर्दैन त्यत्रो वर्षसम्म। त्यस कारणले गर्दा रिपारेसन र यो जस्टिस यो खेल्ने कुरा नै एकदम ठुलो यो गलत कुरा हो। त्यसो हुँदाखेरि यो सँगसँगै नै जानुपर्छ भन्ने नै अहिलेको हाम्रो माग हो।
So what we demand is that truth and reparation, justice and reparation go hand in hand.
यो सँगसँगै जानुपर्छ। अब अर्को चाहिँ लास्टमा यो रिपोर्टको कुरामा म एकलाई अलिकति थपौँ होला होइन।
I want to add something in the report also, about the report also.
यो रिपोर्ट चाहिँ एकदम अहिले महत्त्वपूर्ण समयमा यो सही समयमा निस्केको छ। मैले यो अगाडि हामीले कुरा पनि गरिरहेको थियौँ।
I think this is the very right time for this report to be published. I have talked about this before as well.
यसको एफसिटीमा म पनि सहभागी भएको थिएँ होइन। यो कसरी काम भएको थियो नेपालमा भन्ने थाहा छ मलाई यसको कामको बेलामा।
I was also part of the team, but while the report was ongoing, so I know the process that the team implemented while preparing the report.
यसलाई हामीले जस्तै अहिले मन्त्रालयले एउटा कुरा भन्नुभएको थियो होइन, जस्तै अन्तर्राष्ट्रिय समुदायहरूमा नेपालमा चाहिँ अरू केही पनि सुन्न परेन होइन। हामीले भिक्टिमको कुरा के छ, नागरिक समाजको कुरा के छ डिमान्ड, त्यो खास नसुने पनि हुन्छ। अन्तर्राष्ट्रिय समुदायले के भन्यो भन्ने कुरा चाहिँ एकदम इम्पोर्टेन्ट हुन्छ होइन। त्यसरी लिन्छ राज्यले।
The government takes into account what the international community has to say, rather than what national community has to say, what victims have to say, or what civil societies have to say.
र अहिले यो ऐन आउने बित्तिकै सबै अन्तर्राष्ट्रिय समुदाय प्राय नेपालमा भएको दूतावासहरू सबैले चाहिँ वेलकम गर्नुभयो। त्यो कुरालाई नै एउटा कार्डको रूपमा अगाडि सारिएको छ।
So when the act was enacted, many embassies in Nepal welcomed the act, and this somehow has been used as a card by the government.
र अब हामीले यो रिपोर्ट चाहिँ यसमा भिक्टिमको कुराहरू पनि छ, कानुन व्यवसायहरूको कुरा पनि छ, राज्यकै मान्छेहरूको चाहिँ कुरा पनि छ यसमा होइन। त्यस कारणले गर्दा धेरै मान्छेहरूलाई भेटेर के हो त डिमान्ड र कसरी अगाडि बढ्नुपर्छ भन्ने स्पष्ट छ यसमा।
So this report has what victims have to say, what even politicians have to say, what civil societies have to say. So this report is very comprehensive.
र यसले चाहिँ अब धेरैभन्दा धेरै अब अन्तर्राष्ट्रिय समुदायको कुरा सुन्नै भएको कारणले गर्दाखेरि सबैजनालाई यो रिपोर्टलाई चाहिँ आधार बनाएर रिपोर्टमा त यस्तो भनेको छ नि भनेर भन्नुपर्छ होला मिटिङहरूमा।
Because the government listens to what international community has to say, I think everybody should take this report and say that, look, this report says this as a basis.
त्यसैले अब हामी पीडितको तर्फबाट गर्ने त हाम्रो रिपोर्टमा भए पनि नभए पनि हाम्रो एउटा डिमान्ड क्लियर छ। हामी जसरी एउटा अब क्लियर एउटा धारणा बनाएर अगाडि बढेछौँ भइ नै हाल्छ। तर यो रिपोर्टमा चाहिँ सबैले यसमा काम गरौँ, नेपालमा स्पेसली चाहिँ यो रिपोर्टलाई आधार बनाएर आफ्नो कार्यक्षेत्रहरू बनाऊ भन्ने अनुरोध गर्न चाहन्छु।
For us victims, even if it's mentioned in report or not, this is something we have been saying throughout all these years. So I think everybody should take into account what this report has to say and work together towards it. Thank you.
There was this question whether or where should civil society organization prioritize the amendment or the implementation. I think both. We will continue to advocate for the amendments of those provisions which are not compatible with our international obligations and which undermines victims' right to effective remedies and reinforces existing problems. We will continue to advocate for that. We might also go to the court challenging some of these provisions. But in relations to other provisions, we would like to support the process, engage in the process that would be implemented in a meaningful way. But as I said, implementations also, we foresee a lot of challenges because when we are saying that, hold on, there are some problems in the bill. Clearly, there is a big push because as Gita mentioned, the views that says that this is the ideal, I mean, the language that has been used is that this is a historic moment in the country. This is the historic law. This is the best ever law in the world on transitional justice. So anyone who says anything against this, or not against, like anyone who says like, oh, hold on, there are these issues, these are the demands that we have been demanding for the last 20 years are actually projected, oh, you are against reparation for victims because we have recognized reparation as a victim's right and we have been so generous in providing reparations to victims and you are against the reparations of victims. This is how it has been projected. And we are the one who fought to have this in this law. We are the one to really fought for 18 years to have reparation recognized as victims' right. So, but there are problems in relations to other issues. So we have to monitor how this process unfolds. We have to also monitor how security situation remains for those victims and civil society organizations who continue to engage in this process. International community should be, I think, should have the capacity to understand some of these challenges. I mean, to be very honest with the audience today, we have also some concerns about the ability of the international community to really understand this complex process in the country. There is no human rights advisor or legal expert in any of the embassies in Nepal. There is no presence of OHCHR in the country. Even to provide objective analysis of the law is a problem. And this is the reason why we think this report is very, very important. And I think we really have to, as we are sitting in the UK government also has a lot of stake in this work in Nepal, because it has also welcomed this process. It has pre-existing projects in Nepal to improve justice sectors and women's access to justice. So we really would like to see these supports resulting in genuine, women's access to justice by addressing some of the structural problems that we highlighted earlier on.
Thank you, Mandira. Thanks, everybody. Just as we come to a close, I'd just like to quickly address what you can do. And 3 things come to mind. So firstly would be sharing the report, sharing information about this event, sharing information about the findings. We want to really help ensure that the Nepali authorities and the international community feel positive pressure, not just to do this, but as Mandira said, to do this properly. And so we'd like to invite you to please share this widely in your networks, beyond your networks, do whatever you can to elevate the voices, particularly of Nepali human rights defenders like Mandira and Geeta. And anything you can do to raise awareness and build momentum around this will be very useful. So please do what you can. The second thing would be to write to your MP and ask them what they're doing to make sure that the UK makes victim-centered transitional justice in Nepal a priority. We've heard a lot on the panel about the importance of the role of the international community. And it's important, as we've heard more than once on the panel, that they're not just investing in this, but in terms of money, but in terms of the right messaging and making sure that the funds are spent properly, transparently, and that civil society are consulted, and that the needs of survivors are front and center of whatever happens next. You've heard that our panelists met with MPs in the Foreign Office earlier this week. We need to make sure that they hear loud and clear the answer to why Nepal, why now. So please do that by writing to your MPs and sharing this report. The third thing would be please support PBI. In Nepal, we really want to advocate for follow-up for this report. We want to expand that peer-to-peer learning program that we're facilitating to empower women human rights defenders to combat gender-based violence and to push for justice and an end to human rights abuses. In Honduras, we want to organize a legal delegation for next year. We're gluttons for punishment. That would be our third 3 years on the run, but there's been a concrete request in Honduras to provide a delegation to look at the threats against rural communities, indigenous communities, Afro-descendant communities that are facing really, really grave risks at the hands of business, corrupt politicians and criminal gangs in Honduras. And in the UK, we really want to step up our advocacy so that we can push the new Labour government to do much more quickly and much more effectively than it has so far to put human rights defenders and civil society at the centre of its foreign policy. Most of all, we want to keep providing protection to frontline human rights defenders at risk. So to be able to do all this, we do need your support. It's a tough time for human rights advocacy. It's a tough time for human rights fundraising. So we need your voices. And if you're able to, we need your donations as well. So, and I can tell you a little money goes a long way in PBI. There are QR codes at the back there to both sign up for our newsletter and donate. There's inserts in your reports as well. If you can do either of those things, we'd be very, very grateful. So to close then, the thank yous, there's quite a lot of them, but I'll be as quick as I can. First one, and we can do it with a round of applause to all of our panelists, and particularly Geeta and Mandira. And to all the delegates, as we heard, colleagues in Colombia, Cote d'Ivoire, and Sri Lanka are online as well. They did a heck of a lot of work pro bono, and we are incredibly grateful for that. So please, a round of applause for them too. I'll do all the others together so that we can do one big round of applause at the end. So I want to thank Advocates for International Development, A4ID. We literally couldn't have done this without them. I want to say a big thank you to Advocacy Forum Nepal, an incredible organization and a wonderful partner in this project and in PBI's work in the country. To 33 Bedford Row and the Bar Human Rights Committee of England and Wales for helping convene this event. A massive thank you to Doughty Street Chambers for hosting us once again. I would like to thank the donors who made this possible, UK Aid, the Law Society charity, the Even Cornish Foundation, and again, Doughty Street Chambers. And I would like to thank all of you for coming, all of you for joining online. I don't know how to address you, but I think the camera's there. There will be food and drink now for those of us in the room. Food allergens are listed on sheets on the tables. They'll also tell you what's veggie, what's vegan, what's gluten-free. There's wine, beer, juices, and water. We have about an hour to enjoy that, so get stuck in. And so let's have one last round of applause for yourselves. And thank you very much.